I'm going to briefly talk about the 7 articles of the Constitution. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the specifics of the articles, but I'm going to give you a general overview so that you have a better understanding of what the 7 articles do, why they exist. Well, let's talk about what the Constitution is. The Constitution creates our government. It gives the government certain powers, it limits some of the government's powers, and it also gives citizens, you and me, certain rights. Article 1 is the legislative branch. They make the laws. Article 2 is the executive branch. They enforce the laws. Article 3 is the judicial branch. They interpret the laws, which means they judge the laws. Article 4 talks about states and how states get along and what states have to do. Article 5 talks about amendments. If we wanted to change the Constitution for one reason or another, how do we do it? Article 6 tells us the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, which is the highest law. No other laws top it. And Article 7 talks about ratification, which is a fancy word for approval. How did the Constitution get approved? Now, that's a lot. What does that mean? If you wanted a way to remember what the 7 articles of the U.S. Constitution are, I have a little sentence. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but I think it's helpful. Think of it like this. Leaders enforce justice. States amend supreme rules. Leaders enforce justice. States amend supreme rules. Leaders, legislative, enforce, executive, justice, judicial. States, talks about the states, that's your Article 4. Amend, Article 5 is amend. Supreme law of the land, Article 6. Rules are for ratification. Leaders enforce justice, states amend supreme rules. So now let's just briefly talk about what each article does and what it means. Now, Article 1 creates the legislative branch, and that's just a fancy word for the lawmaking branch. And Article 1 creates something called Congress. Congress is divided into 2 parts, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And these are people who represent you and I, Congress people. They're discussing and debating potential new laws, and they're voting on them. Article 1 gives them that power. It also explains who's allowed to be a congressperson. There are certain specifics. Article 1 explains how a law is made, how an idea goes from an idea to an actual law. Article 1 gives Congress people certain powers, like the power to tax or declare war. There are very specific powers that Article 1 gives members of Congress. And it also says, Article 1, that Congress can't do certain things, and that's because the framers wanted a strong Congress, but not one with unlimited power, because then it would look a lot like the King George days. Article 1 also gives Congress the right to investigate national problems and also to remove federal officials, certain federal officials. So let's say Congress passes a law requiring social media companies to do more to protect children online. Members of the House of Representatives and the Senate debate this new law, and they both like it, and they vote on it, and they approve it. And that bill, because that's a word for a potential law, gets sent to the president. So you got Article 1, says we like this new law. We're going to send it over to the president, Article 2. The president can either sign the bill because the president likes the idea too, and if he does or she does, it's a law. Or the president can veto it, which is saying, I don't like it, I don't want it. And if the president does that, it gets sent back to Congress, Article 1, and then Congress can override that veto, say, yeah, but we still like it, we want it anyway, and make it a law if they all agree. Well, that's Article 1 working and involving Article 2, the president. So let's talk more about Article 2. Article 2 creates the president and the executive branch. It explains who can become president, how the president is elected, what powers the president has, how the president carries out and enforces the nation's laws, and what happens if the president commits serious misconduct. That's all Article 2. So let's say Congress passes a law requiring seatbelts in cars. The president signs the bill into law. So you got Article 1, proposes this law, sends it to the president, Article 2. The president signs the bill into the law, and then has the president's federal agencies help carry out and enforce the law. Meaning, let's make sure that people are wearing their seatbelts, because that's what I signed and that's what I want. This is Article 2 at work, because Article 2 is responsible for enforcing the laws. If another country attacks the United States, the president is in charge of directing the military's response, because the president is what's called commander-in-chief, and the president is commander-in-chief because Article 2 says so. So the president is in charge of the military. If a Supreme Court justice retires, the president gets to choose who gets to fill their seat, because Article 2 says so. So, just to recap, Article 1 makes the laws, that's Congress, but Article 2, the president, gets to enforce the laws, make sure they're carried out, make sure that what Article 1 has chosen actually happens. So Article 3, which is the judicial branch, creates the Supreme Court of the United States, and then gives Congress, back in Article 1, the power to create lower courts. No. So it explains, Article 3 explains how judges decide cases, interpret laws, and make sure everyone follows the Constitution. So Congress, which is Article 1, makes the laws. The President, Article 2, enforces the laws, makes sure that what Congress decided actually happens. And then the Supreme Court of the United States, Article 3, interprets those laws to make sure they're constitutional, which just means, do these laws follow what the Constitution says? Because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and every law that's made has to follow what the Constitution says. If it doesn't, it's called unconstitutional, and it's Article 3, the Supreme Court of the United States, that gets to make that decision. So let's say a school creates a rule that students believe violates their right to free speech. They file a lawsuit, and the case eventually makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court. The judges will decide, the justices in the Supreme Court of the United States will decide, does this rule, this law, violate the rights that the Constitution gives to our citizens? If they say yes, it is an unconstitutional law, and the law has to go bye-bye. So now we're going to talk about Article 4. So even though every state has its own government and its own laws, Article 4 says that the states have to work together as one United States. So Article 4 explains that states must cooperate, respect each other's laws, and treat citizens from other states fairly. It also tells us if we wanted to add a new state, how do we do that? So there's something called the full faith and credit clause, and that's in Article 4. Big words. It's very simple. Let's say you get married in Florida and you want to move to Georgia. Georgia has to recognize that you're married. They can't say, nah, you did that in Florida, you're not married here. Nope. Article 4 says you have to respect that they're married, even though they got married in another state. Same thing if you graduate from high school in one state and you attend college in another state. Article 4 makes sure that the states work together with your official records. Like, just because your birth certificate is from, I don't know, let's say Alabama, and you go to college in North Carolina, the college there has to recognize your Alabama birth certificate. The states have to work together and cooperate. That's all Article 4 says. So Article 5 is about amending or changing the Constitution. And there are times when maybe somebody believes something needs to change, and there's a process for that, and Article 5 tells us what that process is. It allows us to petition for, ask for, try to make the changes we think or we believe are necessary. For example, the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment got rid of slavery throughout the United States. This changed the Constitution to protect freedom for millions of people. That's Article 5 at work. The Constitution originally did not allow 18-year-olds to vote. In 1971, the 26th Amendment was added, giving citizens who are 18 or older the right to vote. That's Article 5 at work. So Article 6 tells us that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. If a state makes a law and it conflicts with what the Constitution says, the Constitution wins every single time. Nothing tops the Constitution. That's called the Supremacy Clause, the supreme law of the land. Article 6 tells us that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So let's imagine your state passes a law saying students can be arrested for criticizing a governor online. Well, because we have the First Amendment right to free speech, that law would violate the Constitution or be considered unconstitutional. Under Article 6, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, so the state law has to go away. It's void. It's bad. It's not going to exist anymore. And it's going to be in Article 3 court, the judicial branch, that determines that. And the last article, Article 7, is very simple. It's called the ratification article. It just says, how was this Constitution ultimately approved? And it says that at least 9 out of the 13 colonies at that time had to agree before the Constitution could take effect. So I guess imagine your school is choosing new school rules. The school has 13 total classrooms. Your principal says these new rules won't take effect unless the majority of students in at least 9 classrooms vote that you like the rules. If at least the majority of at least 9 classrooms out of the 13 agree with the new rules, then the rules take effect. That's basically what Article 7 says. Now, the Constitution was written with this idea of separation of powers and checks and balances in mind. And there is a lot to talk about that. That's the subject of a completely different video, but it is worth mentioning. The founders didn't want one branch to have too much power. So they built in little rules that sometimes allow one branch to oversee or check the power of the other branches. And we talked a little bit about that with the Article 1, 2, and 3. So it's kind of like rock, paper, scissors. If the president vetoes a bill that Congress proposes, Congress can override or undo that veto. So you have Article 1 making a law, Article 2 saying, no thanks. Article 1 going, yeah, but we still want it. But then you still have Article 3 that can say, yeah, you might want it, but it's not constitutional, so no thanks.